So you've heard about components and how useful they are, and you might even have tried to create a few custom components for the player or some of the enemies in your game. One of the problems you might have thought about when venturing into component land is how to set up communication between components. Since we're using Godot, signals is the obvious answer. But what is the best way to connect these signals without creating one big mess? Well, this is what this video is about. And the short answer is, as always, that there really is no best way. Instead, there are several solutions to one problem. And you then have to choose what fits your game and your development style the best. So instead of presenting one single solution as the way of doing it, I'm going to show you 3 different solutions that I think are perfectly valid. And then I'll also try to explain what the pros and cons for the solutions might be. In this video, I'm also assuming that you already have some understanding of what a component is. If this is totally new to you, then I suggest you go watch my tutorial on reusable components in Godot. There's a link to it in the description for this video. I would also love to know which of the solutions you prefer, or if you might be using a completely different solution. Feel free to share your insight in the comments. And as always, the project files for this video will also be available for some of the supporter tiers on Patreon. And now, let's get started. Okay, so for the purpose of this video, I've created a simple game object scene and 2 simple components. They're just called component 1 and component 2. These don't really do anything useful in this example, but you can imagine that component 1 is a hurt box component that knows when the game object is being hit by something, and then component 2 can be a health component that wants to adjust the game object's health when it's hit. So component 2 needs to receive a signal from component 1. In this example, component 1 has a signal called something happened, which we emit from the process method. And component 2 has a method called signal received that we want to be called when the something happened signal is emitted from component 1. This method just has a pass, and then I've also inserted a breakpoint on this line, so it's easy for us to see if this method is being called. Both of these also have a class name, so I can easily add them as nodes to my game object scene. So the problem we want to solve is then how to connect the signal from one component with the method from another component. Okay, so using signals is such an integral part of Godot. So of course we know how to connect them. The simplest solution is, of course, to just select component 1, go to the node menu, locate the signal and connect it through the menu. Done. But then why even make this video, right? The main pros for this solution are obvious. It's simple to use and simple to understand. Straightforward, just do it using the first solution you were ever taught when first learning about Godot. And if you just have a few signal to method connections for each game object, then this is perfectly fine. However, think about what happens when your project grows and thus the number of signal to method connections grow. Connecting them all manually might not only end up being very tedious, it can also be more difficult to debug any problems with the connections you might have. Imagine that you seem to have a problem in just one of your components. Now you could end up having to click through all the nodes that might have a signal connected to it. And, well, then you might realize that the problem might be in another component, and then again you have to check the node menu for all the nodes that this is connected to, and so on. But it can also end up being difficult to manage. there is, however, another pro for this method as well. Neither of the components know who they're connected to, and this makes the system really flexible. The question is then whether you really need this kind of flexibility compared to the clutter it might create. So, one of the biggest issues with the previous solution was all this clicking and having to check connections in the node menu. So how can we fix this? Well, we can just connect everything from code instead. Each component should then connect to the signals it needs itself. To do this, it will need access to the components it wants to connect to. So we can create exported variables for the components and then connect the signals in the ready method. Now, this of course still requires us to manually add the components in the inspector menu. However, if we forget to add one, we will immediately run into problems when we try to run the game, because we can't connect a signal from a node that isn't there. So while this still requires some manual work to connect everything, it's still easier to debug, I think. Another pro for the solution, compared to the previous one, is that the component itself knows what other components it should connect signals to. But I guess that in some cases, this could also be a disadvantage. What do you think? Let me know in the comments below. Even if solution 2 can be easier to maintain and debug than solution 1, it might still not be exactly what you want. Is there a way we can get rid of all this manual clicking and connecting? Well, if we need to create the connections purely from code, then we need a way for a component to get the other components that has signals it wants to connect to. We can create a method for this, but first we have to decide if this should be in the base class for all the components, or if this should be part of the game object. There are pros and cons for both solutions, but I think that the main thing to consider is that Godot only has a single inheritance, so a script or class can only extend from one other script. This means that if you place it in the game object, then all your game objects should inherit from the same base class. You then can't have one game object that extends from character body 2D and another that extends from area 2D and so on. And of course the same goes for creating a base class for all the components. They then have to all extend from the same script. In this video, I'll be creating a base scene for the components, because I think I want more flexibility when it comes to my game objects, especially if I don't want to use components for absolutely everything in them. Okay, so in the base class for our components, we need an onReady variable for the parent of the component. And then we need a method for getting a component of a specific type. To find the component, we can then filter the children's array to only get those of the specified type. And if the result isn't empty, then we can just return the first entry of the result. In the ready method of the component we want to connect, we can then call this new method with the type of the component that has the signal we want to connect to. And if the result isn't null, then we can connect the signal to our method. And now we don't need any clicking at all to set up communication between our custom components. Because of the way we've set this up, we can actually also use our new method to get one of the nodes that aren't a custom component, like an animation player. If we use this, then we don't even need to create exported variables for any of the nodes our custom component needs. However, there is one big problem with this. It restricts us to only have one of each type of component or built-in node. And, well, just by looking at the player in this project here, this would be a problem. It has two separate animation players. One for handling basic movements and one for overlay effects. We could solve this in a number of ways, maybe by also comparing names or something else, but I don't really like it. Instead, I prefer to restrict the getComponent method to only work on our custom components like this. And then add exported variables for everything else the component might need. So while this still requires some clicking to set up, I feel that this is just part of working with a game engine like Godot. Yes, we could create more complicated code to get exactly all the parts we need from code, but this won't necessarily make our setup less error-prone, especially if we start using string comparisons to get the correct parts using only code. And so, there you have it. 3 different solutions to our problem. I think that each of the solutions are useful in their own way, and which one is the better will depend on not only your project, but also your personal developing style. Please let me know in the comments below which one you prefer and why, so we can all get wiser together. If you like this video and want to see more like this, then remember to like, subscribe, hit the bell and all that. Bye!